Now, alrighty, well, it looks like we are all comfy and ready, so we're gonna go ahead and get started. Um, Hello. This is the MSP workshop on barriers to access. And getting right into it, I want to introduce myself first. So I'm Cecily. Hello. Some of you guys, most of y'all probably know me. Maybe you don't. My pronouns are she, they, and I'm the current director of chapter programs at MSP. I'm originally from San Francisco, and I recently just graduated from San Diego State with my major in international studies. And with me here today is Rose, the president of our SCSU MSP chapter. Rose, if you want to introduce yourself.
Hi everyone, I'm Rose. If you don't know me already, like Cecily said, I'm president of Mustard Seeds chapter at SCSU, and I'm a third-year sociology major, and I'm really excited to be sharing some stuff with you today.
Hooray, thank you, Rose. Alrighty, so getting into it, this is a pretty hefty one, so we're not gonna dilly-dally. First off, this is kind of the agenda for tonight, and what we're gonna talk about. First, we're gonna go over the problem. I'm sure all of y'all are already familiar, but I like to, just give a quick refresher so we're all on the same page. Um, Next, we're going to talk about barriers to accessing programs and resources. And then we're going to get more specific and get into more specific barriers for those who are formerly incarcerated, veterans, and then even further breaking it down into some specific demographics. Um, After that, ideally, if I don't talk too much, we will have some time, maybe 10 minutes at the end for an open forum discussion. If you guys would like to talk to me. Um, but getting into it, I just wanted everyone to be on the same page and know that this workshop does not encompass all of the barriers that anyone experiencing homelessness faces. It is the very, very tip of the iceberg, and it barely scratches the surface of the so many obstacles that anyone trying to overcome homelessness has to face. So if anything here is interesting to you, I highly encourage y'all to do your own research and do your own learning if you have the time and capacity to do so. Um, but yes, getting straight into it, we're going to talk about the problem really quick. So what is a problem? Why is homelessness a problem in this country? Um, well, in 2017, there was 1,400,000 people who stayed in shelters in a single year, and this was not including domestic violence shelters. 33% of these people were families with children. And in a single night, there are over 500,000 people sleeping in a shelter, transitional housing, or a public place. And it's important to note that all of these numbers are very, very extremely undercounted because we don't really have a efficient and accurate way to get these numbers. And so the default assumption is that these are all very, very undercounted. And so that is something very important to keep in mind whenever talking about statistics and homelessness. Next is the severe lack of affordable housing that contributes to homelessness. From 1990 to 2016, the average cost of rent rose 20% faster than overall inflation, and the average home price rose 41%. And obviously, the average cost of rent ideally would rise at the same rate as inflation so that people would be able to afford rent and buying homes, but that is not the case. Next, 37 out of 100. As a result of lack of affordable housing for extremely low income renters, only 37 units were available for every 100 people in need. And this is a statistic from 2017. Um, Another big issue that is pretty frustrating is the large number of luxury apartment units and housing units that are built. From 2017 to 18, 90% of new apartment construction was luxury units. And that's cool and all, but people can't afford luxury units. And so what we need is affordable housing for everyone else that isn't able to afford insanely luxurious apartments. Um, And then the last number I have here is 9 million. 9 million extremely low income renters spent more than half of their income on housing and utilities. And if you think about that, that means more than half of their income goes to housing and utilities. As people are, we have other expenses. We have to pay for food, education, transportation, medical costs, so many things, what have you. That are also necessities. And so spending more than half of your income on housing and utilities is not affordable. Really quick, these are a few systemic contributing factors to homelessness. If you guys have been to any of the other workshops, you've probably seen the slide. It's in like all of them. But I like to go over these just so that, we kind of have a background on what's going on. First up, we have systemic racial injustice. Racial minorities experience homelessness at disproportionate rates. Black people make up 13% of the US population, 21% of the poverty population, and 40% of the homeless population. That, for obvious reasons, is extremely disproportionate. And if race and homelessness is something that you want to learn more about, we had an entire workshop on that, which is recorded and up on YouTube and is not that hard to find. But yes. Next, we have stigma. Stigmas against individuals experiencing homelessness prevent them from accessing crucial resources and opportunities. This one's also pretty self-explanatory. People have biases and stigmas against people experiencing homelessness that are incorrect, often incorrect, and prevent them from accessing a lot of things. Next is barriers to access. Stigma is one of the barriers to access, but more specifically, while resources to support individuals experiencing homelessness exist, these resources are often near impossible to access for so many reasons, and this is what today's workshop is about, so we're going to get into that later. Next up, we have a lack of affordable housing. I just talked about that. A lack of physical housing units, rising rent, income inequality, and a bunch of other factors play into why there is such a lack of affordable housing. Next, we have low wages. The current federal minimum wage is $7.25. I think we can all agree that that is not a living wage, especially not here in San Diego where I am. I think some of us are in Riverside, LA, Oregon, Santa Barbara. And I think we can all agree that $7.25 is not a living wage in any of those places. Next, we have mental and physical health care. Oftentimes, a lack of mental or physical health care is the reason one might be experiencing homelessness. It can also be one of the biggest barriers for experiencing homelessness. And this is usually because healthcare is expensive and inaccessible to many people for many reasons. Cool. And so, how do you start to escape homelessness, right? In order to overcome such a challenging time, there are needs that everyone requires, me, you, all of you here. But in order to provide these basic needs to people experiencing homelessness, there are so many obstacles and barriers in the way, which are what we're going to get into later on. But first off, I want us to be able to define what these basic needs are. And so I'm going to open it up to the audience. If anyone wants to just unmute, drop it in the chat if you guys have any ideas of what you think are considered basic needs for someone experiencing homelessness. Okay, we got healthcare, we got shelter, we got food in the chat, clothing, safety. Cool. Transportation, water. These are all wonderful. Thank you. Clean and healthy water specifically. Yes, that is very important. But yes, all of these are correct. Traditionally, the basic needs are food, water, shelter, and clothing. But as society and the world becomes ideally a better place, these needs also expand with that. And so the definition has come to include things like healthcare, transportation, communication, education, sanitation, insurance, personal care items, and there are so many more out there that I personally would consider basic needs in this country specifically. But yeah, that is not the full list, but that is a list of many basic needs that are required for a person to live a, you know, good life. Okay, so now that we know what the problem is and we have defined basic needs, we're going to get into programs and resources, which basically, why is it so hard for someone experiencing homelessness to access programs and resources that are already out there, already exist? So there are three types of barriers. Three main types of barriers. Like I said earlier, this workshop does not encompass everything and all the barriers that exist in the world. But three of the main ones are structural barriers, capacity barriers, and eligibility barriers. A structural barrier is an obstacle that prevents an eligible person from getting access. This can be things like location of programs, like physical geographical locations, how they are organized, and what they require of applicants. And so basically what this means is someone is eligible, but for some reason or the other, they can't get there. And so that's a structural barrier. The next one is a capacity barrier. These barriers are a result of an inadequate amount of available resources, and usually we see this in the form of limited funding or no funding at all. Money. Next, there is eligibility barriers. These are program rules that establish who is eligible or not to receive benefits or be a part of a program or use a resource. These restrictions are usually set at the federal level and cannot be changed locally, which for obvious reasons is a huge barrier because different localities have different needs, and so having a federal nationwide set of criteria is a barrier for obvious reasons because different places require different things. Breaking these down a little more, I'm going to open it up to everyone again. Can anyone give me an example of what they think might be considered a structural barrier? And just so y'all can see this, a structural barrier, like I said earlier, is an obstacle that prevents an eligible person from getting access. So can anybody come up with what they think might be a structural barrier? Martin, we got Wi-Fi. Oh wait, no, I think that was an answer to the earlier question. But can anyone come up with a structural barrier that they think might exist in the world? No disability accommodations, online applications. Anyone else? Feel free to unmute or use the chat or just like scream. Anything works. Okay. Well, I will tell you. There are 7 types of structural barriers. The first one is transportation. The lack of public transportation, individual transportation, and program funds for transportation, and the burden of time travel. Or travel time, not time travel. That was silly. Travel time make it really difficult for people to access services. And so basically what this means is, public transportation, whether that be buses, trains, stuff like that, individual transportation, the lack of access to a car, a bike, a van, whatever it might be, and program funds for transportation. So that would be in forms of like lack of funding for public transportation. And the burden of travel time. Some people have things going on and places to be, and they don't have time to take the bus for 2 hours to get access to some program. The next one is stigma in service providers. And this just means that sometimes there is a stigma within the institutions that are supposed to provide these services and resources for individuals experiencing homelessness. And the general comfort of people experiencing homelessness in these offices and these buildings, and the level of stigma attached to these benefits act as a deterrent for many people when it comes to pursuing different programs and services. Next, we have the complexity and length of benefit applications. Basically, what this means is that a lot of these programs require a lot of work to apply for. There's a lot of paperwork that is hard. And after you file for the paperwork, it takes a really long time for it to go through. And so sometimes that's just like people don't have the option to take the time to do that. And that is okay, and that makes sense. But that shows itself as a really bad structural barrier. Next, we have ID and documentation requirements. A lot of these programs require people experiencing homelessness to supply things like driver's license, birth certificates, social security numbers, stuff like that. And some people just like don't have them. They get confiscated, they get stolen, and some people just don't have them. And that's a completely acceptable thing. But the difficulty in obtaining and keeping ID or photo identification or whatever it may be is another barrier, another structural barrier. Um, six, or no, five, we have the complexity of maintaining enrollment. So a lot of these programs require individuals to renew their eligibility. And sometimes that is a very long process, a very complicated process. And that makes it really difficult for people experiencing homelessness to sustain their access to a benefit or a service. So they might have access to it already, but next year they got to renew it and they just don't have the capacity to do so. And so they lose that benefit. Next, we have lack of knowledge from service providers. There are a lot of programs and services and resources out there, and service providers may not always be aware of all of them. And this is not to fault service providers. That is, a systemic problem that needs to be addressed from the core. Service providers are not responsible for homelessness, is what I'm trying to say. Next, we have system interaction problems or a lack of interaction between programs. And so a lot of these programs rely on each other to create a system in which someone can actually escape homelessness. And so a lack of communication, a lack of relationship between programs creates another set of barriers when accessing benefits and services. Okay, so those are structural barriers. Next, we have capacity barriers. I'm going to open it up real quick again to see if anyone can give me any ideas for what they think capacity barriers might be. Just as a reminder, these barriers are a result of an inadequate amount of resources, and this is usually seen as a lack of funding. So, can anyone come up with an effect of what they think would be an effect of this for someone experiencing homelessness? What do we got? Not enough beds in a shelter, no available resources pertaining to their needs, limited space in shelters, less people receiving aid. Yes, yes, yes. These are all correct. But getting into the two main types of capacity barriers, they are categorized into delayed availability and the lack of availability. And so what delayed availability means is access may be delayed by things like waiting lists for benefits and services that are in short supply. And so it's pretty self-explanatory. The demand does not meet the existing resources. And so people are forced to wait on waiting lists that can be a very long time, months, weeks, years, depending on what program you are trying to access. Next is a lack of availability, just straight up lack of availability. Access may be prevented or its impact reduced by an absence of needed benefits and services, insufficient supply, and insufficient value of benefits and services. And so basically what this means again is there's just not the resources that people need. And usually these impacts are mostly seen in programs for mental health and substance use care, medical care, food stamps, and subsidized housing is where you see most capacity barriers. Cool. And then next we have eligibility barriers. Once again, I'm going to open it up if anyone has any ideas on what they think might be an eligibility barrier. We can get real specific with this one. Let's see. Again, an eligibility barrier is a barrier in which programs have rules that establish really specific criteria for who can and cannot receive benefits. So we got citizenship, that's a very good one. Gender identity, lack of college degree, age, disability, age. Yes, 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 you are so correct. Let me get to the slide. Okay, so there are a lot of reasons why someone might not qualify for a certain program resource. There are 6 main ones. Obviously, these are not the only ones. There are so many intersectional identities that exist and so many life circumstances that exist that can prevent someone from accessing a program. But the first one is criminal history. Criminal and legal problems often pose a huge barrier for people. This can include previous incarcerations, felonies, misdemeanor charges, and anything on someone's criminal history can leave a person ineligible for a very wide range of services. Next, we have categorical requirements. And I think this is kind of what we were all getting at earlier in the chat. Categorical requirements are things like age, disability status, residency, gender identity, and all those things that limit the eligibility of someone experiencing homelessness. And different programs have different categorical requirements. But as a general idea, whatever they may be, they are usually posing a barrier to one group or the other. Next, homelessness. A primary challenge for homeless individuals wanting to use resources that are made for them is difficulty in documenting and verifying how long they've been homeless. So a lot of these programs need to define an individual as chronically homeless before they provide any resources or help. And oftentimes it's hard for someone who has been, on the streets for X amount of time to be able to record how long they've been there and have proof of that. Next, we have family size and composition. This is one where different programs have different eligibility requirements based on family size and things like your family composition. And so a lot of programs don't have benefits available for single adults. A lot of them are only for families. A lot of them are only for, mothers with children. Some of them are only for people experiencing different things. And so that is another huge barrier. Almost there. We got 5. We got mental health and substance use. Access to mental health and substance use services may be prioritized according to diagnostic criteria. And so basically what this means is that a lot of programs may not allow an individual to access that program unless they go through a designated substance use program, like rehab or something like that. And then finally, we have health insurance. Access to health insurance is often necessary to be eligible for medical services, whether that be mental health, substance use services, physical health, reproductive health, all of those things. A lot of places just require health insurance. And I think we have all heard about how health insurance is not affordable or accessible to many people in this country. And so obviously bringing that down to people experiencing homelessness, that is a huge barrier. Yeah. Cool. And then here we have a couple more barriers that aren't in the 3 categories that I just mentioned. In 2007, they did a study And a formerly homeless man now working as a mental health services administrator described a lot of barriers that they experienced as rudeness, disrespect, and just negative stigmas that people experiencing homelessness often face from service providers, like I mentioned earlier. A lot of these agencies often opt to serve those who are easiest for their staff to understand and work with, which frequently puts people experiencing homelessness at the end of the line. Um, Basically, what this means is when um, there are a lot of people that are eligible for a program, a lot of service providers will opt to work with people who are low income rather than already homeless, if that makes sense. And so the argument that Wireman makes is that benefits should be made available to everyone who meets the eligible criteria, and that service providers should not be able to choose the people who are easier to work with. Other barriers that are often present are those that are kind of inherent to being in a homeless situation. And these can be things like lack of access to a phone, a mailing address, transportation, higher likelihood of having health issues, substance use issues, criminal history. A lack of social support is a really big one. And just different things like that that obviously vary from person to person, but are inherent to being homeless. Next, hopping into our next section here, we have the more specific barriers that formerly incarcerated individuals experience. We also have a forum. We had a forum on this topic last month, I think. And so if this is something that you guys are super interested in, again, I encourage y'all to go on YouTube and look up the recording for that. We had some really great guest speakers that were able to provide a lot of insight, way more than I will be able to provide you, but I will do my best. Really quick, everything that we're going to talk about is an additional challenge that veterans face on top of any existing challenges that any individual experiencing homelessness faces. And so these aren't the only things that exist out there, they are just another thing that exists. But getting into it, looking at this chart, we can see how homelessness rates among formerly incarcerated people is detrimentally, disproportionately, insanely higher than that of the general public. I don't know if you guys can see my cursor, but down here we have the white dotted line for homelessness rates among the general public by gender, race, age, stuff like that. And then we can see how disproportionate it is amongst people who were formerly incarcerated. But yeah, I just thought this was a really telling graph that would be worth sharing. Another thing that's important for or when discussing homelessness and those who are formerly incarcerated is the concept of the revolving door. And this concept is neither cool nor fresh. It is very sad. And it is basically the idea that people who experience homelessness and are formerly incarcerated become stuck in a revolving door, a cycle in which they just go back and forth and back and forth. People who have been to prison one time experience homelessness at a rate 7 times higher than the general public. However, once they've been incarcerated more than once, the rate that they become incarcerated or the rate that they are at risk for homelessness jumps to 13 times more than the general public. And so basically, we can see that the more times you're incarcerated and being incarcerated at all, the higher chance of homelessness, the higher the chance that you experience homelessness. This is due to a lot of things. And one of the main things is the different ways that law enforcement agencies aggressively enforce offenses like sleeping in public spaces, panhandling, public urination, and things like that that are kind of inherent to a homeless situation. But these are like the small things that law enforcement agencies use to unnecessarily funnel people back into prison or jail for. And then the cycle continues and chronic homelessness continues to exist. So what are some of the struggles for those who are formerly incarcerated once they are out of prison or jail? Excuse me. Struggles to find a stable place to live due to discrimination. Discrimination combined with affordable housing shortages continues to drive the exclusion of formerly incarcerated people from the housing market. In addition to this, property owners, landlords, public housing authorities have the power to implement their own screening criteria when it comes to application merits from applicants. And so basically what this means is like landlords, public housing authorities, property owners, they can basically create their own criteria for who can and cannot live at their property. And so, does anybody here, except Geetha, because she helped me with this, but does anyone here, other than Geetha, have any ideas what these screening criteria might be? Gabby says references. That is true. Anything else? Nada. Already. It's okay. I'll just tell you. First, we have unreasonably high security deposits. That is pretty self-explanatory. A lot of places, as a deterrent to people who are low income, require really, really high security deposits. Next is credit score checks. Obviously, someone who has been incarcerated for a long period of time either does not have a credit score or their credit score is not good because they have been incarcerated. Next is professional references. A lot of landlords, property owners, stuff like that require professional references like they do at jobs. And I think it's pretty obvious why this is not a good criteria for people who have been incarcerated. If you've been incarcerated, you probably don't have any professional references because you have been in prison for a long time. Next are criminal record checks, which we talked a little bit about earlier, but just criminal background checks that automatically disqualify someone from being able to get a place, whether that be misdemeanor charges, felony charges, whatever they want to use to discriminate against having you live there. They can do that because they have the power to create their own screening criteria. Next, this is something that's interesting and relevant to this topic that is happening right now. For those of us in California, there's currently a bill in the California State Assembly, AB 717, that's goal is to ensure that all inmates who leave prison with a valid ID card. Currently, that doesn't exist. I can tell you why. I think it should exist already. But this would implement a program in which inmates could leave prison and leave with a valid ID, which would be very beneficial. This is still a super, super new bill. I think it just got introduced a few weeks ago, and so it has not been voted on yet. I think it's still in the process of like revisions and stuff like that. But if it's something you're interested in, I highly recommend, looking it up. And if you're in California and you're passionate about this, you can always give your local assembly member a call and voice your beliefs if that is something you'd like to do. Cool. So next section, we're going to talk about veterans. Again, everything that we talk about is an additional challenge that veterans face on top of existing challenges. Just like for formerly incarcerated people, these are just more challenges that an individual has to try to overcome, and not the only ones that they have to try to overcome. So veterans are 50% more likely to experience homelessness than other Americans. 50%. That is a lot. Why? So what challenges do veterans face once they are no longer active duty military. Some of the most significant challenges are health related. A considerable number of veterans suffer from traumatic brain injuries. Other problems include PTSD, depression, anxiety, substance use, and a lot of veterans suffer from more than one health condition, multiple health conditions. Many also experience sexual trauma from their time in the military, and this can have obviously both mental and physical effects. And so now we know that most of the challenges that veterans face are health related. So, who is supposed to be addressing these health related problems? Well, that's where the Veterans Administration comes in, the VA. The VA has a Veterans Health Administration, the VHA, that provides health care for many veterans. However, the accessibility and quality of services is not consistent within the VA. They've done studies and they've shown that a large number of veterans do not receive any treatment or even diagnoses for medical and physical health conditions. And many veterans don't even know how to apply for mental health care benefits, are unsure if they're eligible, or are unaware that they even exist. And so, what that means is basically a lot of veterans don't even know that the resources to help them exist out there. If they do, these services are not consistent across the country. Um, yeah. Other barriers to veterans accessing resources are difficulty getting to medical facilities because of their inconvenient location or lack of transportation. That's one that I think kind of relates to just homelessness in general. Next is concerns taking time off work and potentially harming their careers. And then we have fear that discrimination due to the stigma around mental health issues, especially the stigma around mental health issues in the military, could lead to loss of contact with or custody of their children as a result of them needing support. And all of these things pose themselves as barriers to people, to veterans trying to access different programs and resources that are available to them. Some non-health related barriers. We know that most of them are health related, but there are non-health related ones. And like I said earlier, this is not all of them. There are probably so many more that I'm not going over, but I only have an hour and I do my best. But first, we have readjusting. Some returning service members have difficulty readjusting to civilian life. For example, at times, the unemployment rate for veterans who served after 9/11 has almost been twice the rate of non veterans who are about the same age. Next, we have a lack of data. Basically, there is like a really, really severe lack of research in terms of assessing the economic, social, and health impacts of deployment on military service members as well as their families. And obviously, if we don't know the research, if we don't have the data, it's hard to know how to support them. Next, we have greater diversity. In the last 20 years, um, more specifically after 9/11, obviously a lot of people joined the military, and that resulted in a greater diversity within the military. And so, for example, women veterans who served in Iraq and Afghanistan have a higher need for mental health care compared with women who served in wars previous to Iraq and Afghanistan. Similarly, tailoring treatment to different racial, ethnic, um, sexual minorities has been a challenge for this country because prior to the last 20 years, there has not been such diversity in the military. And so, obviously, as diversity changes within the military, the services that you provide to them has to also change and accommodate those needs. Um, okay, so last section, we have demographics. And for this one, I'm gonna hand the floor over to Rose. Actually, really quick, if anyone has any questions, comments, stuff like that, feel free to just like drop them in the chat. I forgot to say that earlier. But yeah, all yours, Rose.
Cool. Thank you, Cecily. Also, just before I start, thank you to everyone for being here today to learn more about barriers to access. I see a lot of SDSU people here, so thank you. I appreciate you. But we're going to be moving on into our fifth section on demographics. And we're going to be highlighting barriers to access for homeless women, BIPOC, LGBTQ, and people with disabilities. Of course, this is by no means a full scope on the barriers that people in these communities face. So please don't come at me. This is, everything we discuss is an additional challenge that certain demographics face on top of the existing challenges that any individual experiencing homelessness faces. So first up, we have women. First off, women may have a greater need for healthcare due to illnesses or diseases that are more prevalent in women, in addition to reasons relating to reproductive health. So, however, homeless women often face barriers to achieving this type of healthcare. And first is pretty obvious, high cost. We all know that healthcare is very expensive, which would prevent any person experiencing homelessness from prioritizing their health. And secondly, symptoms not believed as credible. So women in general often report that their symptoms aren't taken as seriously by physicians, and this phenomenon may increase with the stigma of homelessness. And so this may lead to them believing it's really not worth the effort, the effort to seek healthcare. Third, fear of losing children. So, since women are often left with the responsibility of childcare, they're more likely to hold the fear of having their children taken away if they are found to be homeless. And of course, these barriers do have their negative consequences. So, first off, this may lead to a higher risk of unplanned pregnancy due to lack of access to contraceptive measures like birth control. Secondly, another consequence can be higher birth complications for expectant mothers facing homelessness. And actually, women experiencing homelessness are more than twice as likely to experience a complication that affects their health during birth, and almost twice as likely to have an early or threatened labor. And of course, besides healthcare, when women do have access to programs such as job training, they do run into the trouble of finding childcare. And this can be very difficult because childcare does cost a lot of money, and this can be just another financial strain that impedes socioeconomic mobility for homeless women. Moving on to our slide on BIPOC communities. If you don't know, this stands for Black, Indigenous, or other people of color. So a lot of people in BIPOC communities, they have either learned English as a second language, or they don't know how to speak English fluently. And so general knowledge of available resources can be very limited, and navigating these resources in a difficult language can be an isolating and stressful challenge. And I actually used to be a volunteer coordinator for homeless outreach last year, and in my experience, there were a lot of instances where we ran into people who did not speak English, and this served as a really big challenge for them to get help, as well as a challenge for us to help them. Our next point, discrimination. This one is pretty obvious. Like we've mentioned before, people of color often struggle at the hands of discrimination, and this prevents them from access to necessary programs. There was a whole workshop last month specifically on this, so I won't be going like that in depth into it, but there is a graph right here on the right that just shows the how BIPOC communities are overly represented when it comes to homelessness in comparison to their percentage of the total population. So, for example, this was mentioned in I think it was last month's workshop. Historical redlining of BIPOC communities has made it difficult for Black and Brown folks to buy homes. So this just makes it difficult to really just access more affordable housing. Additionally, to our last point here, we have lack of quality services in BIPOC neighborhoods. So minority neighborhoods are more likely to be exposed to poor quality programs. So, for example, a community rec center in a predominantly by person of color neighborhood may have a higher tendency to be underfunded and understaffed. So that would lead to it being more difficult to find, or not find, even difficult to carry out programs that give access to these basic needs that we mentioned earlier. Moving on to our slide with people with disabilities. So first point, transportation. I think that is pretty obvious. I think someone mentioned earlier the ADA, or Americans with Disabilities Act. So even though disability conscious architecture is regulated through the ADA, there is existing ableist infrastructure that makes it very challenging for folks with disabilities to get available services for them to navigate them independently. And this is because our systems were really built and founded without the inclusion of people with disabilities. And because of that, ironically, or maybe even purposefully, efforts to help them aren't even very accessible. So for people with disabilities, they may qualify for benefits from SSI, that stands for Supplemental Security Income. So what that is, it just gives you a monthly stipend for people that meet the requirements of a disability. But in order for that to, to get to you, individuals, they have to fill out an application. And just to give you an insight into what this application process is like, and pay attention because I'm going to ask you a question about this. So the SSI application, it is roughly 19 pages long. It requires detailed questions about living arrangements, resources, income, and medical history. Applicants must provide a variety of documents to support the information. Sorry, I lost my place. Information on the application form. Applicants are sent to the state's disability determination service, where they decide if the applicant has an eligible disability as defined by SSA regulations, and they may ask applicants to undergo a reimbursed medical exam. So after taking all of those into account, how could this possibly be a barrier to access for folks with disabilities? Feel free to type it in the chat. People might not have the money up front for the medical exam. Several requirements means more barriers, harder for people to meet those. One more person. Yeah, people may not understand the questions being asked. Definitely. Abiana says, depending on the disability, the application itself is hard to fill in. People may not have access to internet or printer for documents. Yes, exactly. All great answers. So with it being 19 pages long, that can just be hard generally to keep track of. That can also be very mentally or physically draining or exhausting to fill out by yourself. Providing documents to prove income can be very difficult to obtain, like who said that? Ella said, not have access to internet or printer for the documents. Also with medical history, a lot of people who are homeless don't have just one medical provider, so that can be difficult to track that. And also just having a place to store these documents, because people who are experiencing homelessness are often moving around a lot. Additionally, the DDS may even deny you if you do have a disability for reasons like if your documents aren't up to date. So yeah, a lot of barriers for that one. Moving on to our slide on LGBTQ+. So a lot of folks who identify with the LGBTQ+ community, they are at very high risk of homelessness. And this is due to getting kicked out for household conflict within their families because of their sexual identity, which is just really upsetting. And so 55% of LGBTQ youth and 67% of trans youth cited this as the cause of their homelessness. So over half of LGBTQ plus folks who are homeless, it's really just due to getting kicked out most of the time. And a barrier that they face is the lack of LGBTQ specialized resources. And this leads to a lack of access to safe spaces for homeless LGBTQ folks, as they are at higher risk of discrimination and violence just because of their existence. So just to give you a scope into what they may experience into when they are inside shelters. So LGBTQ folks report consistent discrimination from shelter staff based on religious beliefs, undermining their sense of security and acceptance, which if they are fleeing from household conflict within their family, this sense of security and acceptance, that's already pretty low, pretty weakened. Shelter gender segregation and being assigned the wrong gender category can create significant emotional stress and harm, especially for transgender youth. And just a trigger warning for sexual harassment. Transgender girls who are forced to room with boys often report verbal and physical sexual harassment, and transgender boys may have to shower in the open with cisgender boys, leaving them vulnerable to sexual harassment and assault. So this just goes to show really the importance of specialized care for individual identities, because things like this really shouldn't be happening. I think recognizing the intersections of the experience of homelessness can really prevent more of these barriers from happening.
Alrighty, friends. Well, that is pretty much it for today's forum. It is 6:55. We got 5 minutes for our open forum. If anybody has anything they would like to say, excuse me. Any questions, comments, concerns, compliments, criticisms, other words that start with a C, that you guys would like to share, now is your time. I'm here. Rose is here. We're all here to talk. But yeah. Any thoughts? If not, here's my email and my phone number. Feel free to reach out. I am going to stop the recording now. It's going to do the robot voice thing, isn't it?